Welcome back. In this lecture today, we'll try to understand the concept of nuclear disarmament and how it will contribute to the future of global peace. For a large group of people, the only way we realistically hope to secure our nuclear future is by getting rid of the nuclear weapons. That basic claim lies at the heart of the nuclear disarmament thinking, and it is also why the topic matters so much for the broader theme of the future of global peace. If peace is understood not merely as the temporary absence of war, but as the creation of a more durable and secure international order, then the continued existence of nuclear weapons presents a profound problem. Their destructive power is also so vast and the consequences so far reaching that they sit uneasily with any serious vision of a stable and peaceful global future. Now, this is not a modern phenomenon. Even before the first atomic bombs were dropped in 1945, scientists and other leading figures had called for a ban on these new weapons with unimaginable destructive power. Since the beginning of the nuclear age, a global conscience for total nuclear elimination has started, albeit with the stagnated periods of invigoration and heightened global interest. The global disarmament record, however, is mixed. Nuclear weapons have not been abolished totally, as we know, and yet at the same time, the stockpiles have been reduced massively since the height of the Cold War. Several states, they have given up the bomb over that time. Large parts of globe has been converted to nuclear weapon-free zones, and in recent years, pressure for global movements towards disarmament has again increased. The question then is not simply whether nuclear disarmament has succeeded or failed. It is actually how the struggle over nuclear disarmament shapes the possibilities and the limits of global peace in the future. Now, to understand this, let's understand what is global nuclear disarmament. Nuclear disarmament can be understood as different label. At its most ambitious, it refers to the complete abolition of nuclear weapons from the international system. At a more limited level, it can also refer to the reductions in arsenals, restrictions on testing, or the creation of legal and political frameworks designed to lessen the role of nuclear weapons in state policy. In this sense, the nuclear disarmament overlaps with but not identical to arms control and non-proliferation. Arms control seeks to manage competition and reduces risk, whereas non-proliferation seeks to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to additional states. But disarmament goes further. It asks whether the world should continue to live with nuclear weapons at all. Now, that question has always been both practical and philosophical. Practical because it concerns strategy, verifications, alliance politics, and security dilemmas. And also philosophical because it concerns how security should be understood, what kind of violence can ever be legitimate, and whether a peaceful future can rest on the threat of catastrophic destruction. Now, in this lecture, it's clear that the desire to move toward a nuclear disarmament or disarmed world had persisted precisely because so many have concluded that the long-term future of humanity cannot safely remain or dependent on the deterrence or nuclear deterrence forever. Coming to the next section, how the nuclear disarmament movement started over the time. People and communities lobbied against nuclear weapons even before the first bomb was built. At a time when such weapons were still largely a scientific possibility, but a global movement for nuclear disarmament uh, only fully manifested after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The movement grew rapidly because the bomb revealed a form of destruction that seemed to exceed the moral and political categories of earlier warfare. This was not simply, another weapon. It was a weapon that could erase cities, devastate population, and potentially imperil human civilization itself. The movement against the bomb developed out earlier peace movements and soon came to conclude, soon also it included a wide range of actors, notably many leading scientists. In 1945, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was formed by former Manhattan Project physicists to enter the public or to educate the public about the devastation of nuclear weapon and the nuclear issues and press for the elimination of nuclear weapons. In the later years, former Manhattan Project members established the Federation of American Scientists. Since 1947, the Bulletin's doomsday clock has served as the recognized symbol of how close the world is to the nuclear catastrophe. The closer the clock moves to the midnight, the closer the world is thought to be to disaster. In this way, nuclear disarmament was never only about military policy. It was also about public education and moral warning, and the attempt to shape how humanity imagined its own future. The first wave of global disarmament movement. It began in 1940s and continued until the early 1960s. It saw the creation of a variety of new groups aligned against the bomb, the first major protest and early attempts to build the international institutions capable of reducing or eliminating the nuclear bomb. In 1946, the US proposed the creation of an International Atomic Development Authority under the UN. The so-called Baruch Plan called for international oversight of atomic energy and in principle the elimination of nuclear weapons. Yet it was rejected by the Soviet Union and disappeared after the first Soviet atomic test in 1949. This early failure is important because it shows how quickly the promise of international control was overwhelmed by the mistrust and Cold War rivalry. Even so, disarmament efforts did not disappear. In 1952, the UN General Assembly created the UN Disarmament Commission. Over the time, a series of bodies emerged to facilitate nuclear arms control and disarmament negotiation. Alongside these official efforts, major intellectual and civil society initiatives also developed. Pandit Nehru called for a standstill agreement in 1954. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955 warned that in any future global conflict or world war, nuclear weapons would almost certainly be employed and urged governments to seek peaceful means for the settlement of the disputes. The manifesto became the centerpiece for the Pagos Conference on Science and World Affairs. In 1957, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament was formed in Britain. While SAIN emerged in the United States, these groups also helped turn nuclear disarmament into visible and organized public cause. Coming to the next, as the Cold War intensified, so too did the concern about nuclear weapons at that time. The nuclear weapon testing and the ever-increasing possibility of nuclear war. One of the major concerns of the 1950s and early 1960s was nuclear testing, especially atmospheric testing and its human and environmental effects. The public activism helped place the testing at the center of international political debate. In 1961, President John Kennedy captured the essence of the disarmament movement at the UN when he declared that every man, woman, and child lived under a nuclear shore of Damocles, dangling by the you know slenderest of threads, capable of being cut by accident, miscalculation, or madness. The weapons of war, he said, must be abolished before they abolish us. Just a few weeks later, the US, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom began discussing the partial test ban treaty. The PTBT of 1963 plays significant and owed much to the pressure generated by the disarmament movements across the globe. Yet this was also the movement or the moment when concerns about nuclear war reached its pinnacle in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The crisis made, you know, unmistakably clear that the nuclear war could result not only from deliberate aggression but also from miscalculation under conditions of intense rivalry. In that sense, the crisis reinforced a central disarmament insight that the future of global peace could not safely rest forever on a system in which catastrophe remains permanently possible. The second wave of nuclear disarmament, it started around again in 1980s as the US and the Soviet Union entered what was at that time often been called the Second Cold War, basically. Now, this period was characterized by a renewed nuclear arms race, very significant arms revamping, and the rhetoric and tension. Also, a widespread public fear that the nuclear war had once again become thinkable or a reality. It also generated a new wave of global activism. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and the European Nuclear Disarmament Group were both founded in 1980. The IPPNW was especially important because it framed nuclear war not only as a strategic issue but also as a medical and humanitarian catastrophe that could not meaningfully be managed once began. Now, this period also saw an extraordinary resurgence of protest. In the US, the nuclear freeze movement called for a halt to testing, development, and deployment by both superpowers. In 1982, over 1 million people gathered in New York's Central Park to protest the arms race. In Britain, CNT organized huge anti-nuclear demonstrations, while Graham Common became an enduring site of women-led protest against the deployment of NATO cruise missile. The second half of the 1980s then saw a renewed political embrace of the disarmament. In 1986, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev came remarkably close to the far-reaching agreement on nuclear abolition. Although no final deal was reached, largely because of the disagreement over the Strategic Defense Initiative, it remains perhaps one of the closest the world came together for a political agreement on eliminating nuclear weapons. It revealed both the extraordinary possibility and the persistent fragility of the disarmament. Coming to the next, the legal, critical, and feminist approaches to nuclear disarmament. Now, let's turn from the historical webs of activism to the intellectual approaches that have sought to think differently about nuclear disarmament. It highlights three particulars, as I have just mentioned. First, in case of legal approach, it focuses on the legality of possessing and using nuclear weapons under international order. The problem is that it is difficult to envisage a scenario in which the threat of use of nuclear weapons would fit comfortably with central tenets of international humanitarian law. This also includes distinction between military and civilian targets, proportionality, and the requirement that force be used only as a last resort. In 1996, the International Court of Justice concluded that no source of law explicitly prohibited possession or use, but it also emphasized that any use would have to conform to international law. That legal ambiguity has remained central to the disarmament debate. Coming to the next, the critical approach argued that the nuclear weapons should be seen not simply as military tools, but also as social objects embedded in identity, interest, and power relationship. It challenged the realist assumption that the nuclear weapons are naturally stabilizing and indispensable for survival. Instead, in the critical approach, they seek to devalue and stigmatize and delegitimate nuclear weapons. Coming to feminist approach, it insists that the nuclear question cannot be fully understood without attention to the gender, especially masculinity. Feminist scholars argue that the nuclear weapons have often been tied to ideas of masculine strength, dominance, and control, while disarmament has too often been coded as weak or unrealistic. Across these approaches, a common theme emerges. That is, changing how we think about nuclear weapons is part of changing the political condition that make disarmaments impossible. Coming to few states that has given up the bomb over the time. One of the most important arguments made in favor of nuclear disarmament is that while difficult, it is not entirely without precedent. A number of states have pursued the nuclear weapons capability since 1945 before choosing not to proceed with the weapon, and some states has given up actual nuclear weapons or the infrastructure required to sustain them. Now, these cases are politically important because they challenge the claim that once states acquire a nuclear capability, they will never voluntarily give it up. South Africa is a classic example of this. In the 1980s, the apartheid government constructed 6 nuclear bombs. Yet, in the early 1990s, with the end of the Cold War and shortly before the collapse of the apartheid president, they declared that the country has voluntarily destroyed these weapons and closed the relevant facilities. South Africa then acceded to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon country. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Ukraine, they inherited nuclear weapons on their territory. Although the negotiations were not straightforward, all three eventually agreed to return these weapons to Russia and join the NPT as a non-nuclear states. These are the cases are evidence that the norm of disarmament and non-proliferation remains strong in large parts of the world. They do not prove that the global abolition is near, but they do show that the political choice still matters. Coming to the nuclear weapon-free zone, one of the great success stories probably of the nuclear disarmament is this. Now, these are regional agreements through which states legally prohibit nuclear weapons within a defined area. The large part of the globe, especially in the southern hemisphere, are now covered by such nuclear weapon-free zone agreements, and these zones matter for several reasons. They reduce the geographical space in which nuclear weapons are considered legitimate or acceptable. They embed anti-nuclear norms in regional legal frameworks. They also show that the disarmament need not only be imagined as a single dramatic act of global abolition, it can also proceed through layered, regional and incremental forms of political change. For the future of global peace, this is significant. Nuclear weapon-free zones also demonstrate that the security can be imagined and institutionalized without reliance on nuclear weapons. They do not remove the arsenals of the major nuclear power, but they do expand the political and moral space in which a nuclear weapon-free world can be thought possible. Coming to the Global Zero agenda and the ban treaty. After the end of the Cold War, the push for global nuclear disarmament lost momentum. India and Pakistan tested their nuclear weapon in 1998. US Senate refused to ratify the CTBT in 1999, that is Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and North Korea began its march towards becoming a nuclear armed state. Yet, by the mid-2000s, a third wave of international nuclear disarmament movement began to emerge. This revival was driven partly by the fears of nuclear accidents, nuclear terrorism, and possibility that the nuclear weapons might fall into the wrong hands or non-state actors. In 2007, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War launched the International Nuclear Campaign to abolish the nuclear weapons, or which is ICAN. Around the same time, the Global Zero Agenda outlined a phased plan for complete and verifiable elimination. The movement also received major symbolic support from President Barack Obama, who in Prague in 2009 declared America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. The final major product of this third wave was the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, agreed by the UN in 2017. The treaty prohibited participation in a wide range of nuclear weapons activities and also included obligations regarding victim assistance and environmental remediation. Its practical limits are obvious, not least because not current nuclear armed states has joined it. Yet, its symbolic and normative importance is considerable. It is an attempt to delegitimize nuclear weapons in law and politics and thereby to reshape the debate about what kind of future global order is acceptable. Now coming to the next, that why still remains a very difficult question, nuclear disarmament, and in the current scenario also we can see the same, that despite the renewed interest in nuclear disarmament, fulfilling these agendas remained deeply problematic. There are several obstacles that are related to that. The first and perhaps the biggest is who goes the first. That is one of the most important problems. How can a state be convinced to give up the nuclear weapons while others retain them? This is closely linked to the security dilemma. Even if disarmament would make everyone safer, in the long term, states may still fear being the first to disarm in a short term. A second challenge is that the knowledge behind nuclear weapons can never be uninvented. Even if all current arsenals were dismantled, the scientific and technical capability to build nuclear weapons would remain. Third is the verification and compliance are very difficult. States may worry that others could hide weapons and fail to comply, or seek rapid redevelopment or redeployment. And fourth, any state with civilian nuclear infrastructure and a sufficiently advanced industrial base may possess at least a latent capability to pursue nuclear weapons in the future. Now, these difficulties do not make disarmament impossible, but they do explain, why progress is uneven and why symbolic achievements do not automatically become strategic transformation. The future of global peace, in this sense, depends not only on moral conviction, but also on solving enduring problems of distrust, verification, and political order. Coming to the last part of this lecture, the politics of nuclear disarmament is best understood as a long and unfinished struggle over the future of world order. Its record is mixed. Nuclear weapons have not been abolished, and the major nuclear powers continue to assign them a central role in security policy. Yet, it would be wrong to describe the disarmament project as a simple failure. Nuclear stockpiles are far below the Cold War levels. Several states has given up the bomb. Large part of the globe are covered by nuclear weapon free zone. Civil society, legal argument, humanitarian activism, and critical scholarship have all helped to challenge the legitimacy of the nuclear weapon itself and keep the possibility of abolition alive. The deeper significance of nuclear disarmament lies in the kind of future it asks us to imagine. Can the world continue to indefinitely on the basis of deterrence or permanent vulnerability and the threat of annihilation? Or must a genuinely peaceful global future require the gradual delegitimization and eventual elimination of the nuclear weapons? It obviously there is no easy answer to this, and it also shows instead that the disarmament advances in waves, the progress is fragile, and that the setbacks are common. But obviously there is renewed enthusiasm because of the positive side of nuclear disarmament movement that we have just learned, and it is likely that is going to be strong in future, especially if nuclear dangers becomes more immediate. Thinking about the future of global peace, that is the central lesson of this, and the nuclear question is not a closed chapter of the Cold War. It remains one of the most prominent test of whether international politics can move beyond managing existential danger and towards building a more durable peace by probably achieving nuclear disarmament in near future. Thank you for your time. To know more about this topic, you can refer to a book, The Politics of Nuclear Weapon by Andrew Forter. Thank you.